thank you for having me. I get the honor of being the last person keeping you from your alcohol, so bear with me. So this is also a paper on reviews, but it's a different paper. So this is a paper on reviews in a system, in a platform where we might not expect the reviews to be very informative. Okay, so we're not going to take it as given that these reviewers are being completely honest. Okay, so to motivate this, I want to start with a simple thought experiment. So suppose you want to hire an RA, and you find out that they do a great job. Would you go and tell all of your colleagues about this great RA? Well, on one hand, you want to reward this great RA with maybe some more work. On the other hand, now your colleagues are going to want to hire them, right? And potentially that will bid up the wage you have to pay the RA, or they might not be available, or what have you. It might not be in your best interest to provide this information. Okay? And so that's exactly what's happening in online labor markets. Okay? So we have this system where we have a centralized platform. We're bringing together workers and firms. And the idea is the employers are providing these reviews, that's information, but maybe there's this incentive not to be providing this good information. Okay, so online labor markets, it brings together in the one I'm studying, it's mostly third world workers and first world firms. We're talking about all the work is done remotely. Okay, so we potentially have a high degree of asymmetric information in this market, and they're relatively short-term jobs, so I can observe kind of lots of job changes in this case. Okay, so as I said, there's kind of this incentive, or potentially this incentive, to be, at least uninformative, or try and bias the reviews to take advantage of this. Okay, so the goal of this paper is to kind of test this and see if we can, kind of test the information content in these reviews and see are they conveying information about the workers' productivity. Okay, so just to kind of preview results, I'm going to find that receiving a good review relative to a really bad review, and I'll tell you what that means in a minute, increases the worker's next wage by 14%. Okay, so this is saying that the reviews do affect wages. Okay, so there is some information content going on here in that the reviews are kind of potentially providing information about productivity or something such that the worker is being paid more. Okay, we also find that reviews, getting a good review relative to a really bad review again, is going to decrease your probability of leaving as a worker. Okay, so it's going to affect kind of how long you stay in this market as well, which is also suggestive of there's some information content, right? Because we wouldn't expect the attrition rate to be affected by something that was just noise. Okay, and then the question is why? So why are we seeing this? Why are, given this incentive to be uninformative, why are we seeing employers provide information? And I show that workers are twice as likely to want to work again for an employer that has left them a good review relative to someone who's left them a bad review. Okay, so this is kind of suggestive evidence that maybe workers are kind of punishing firms who leave them bad reviews by refusing to work. Because remember, this is a two-sided market, so workers can always, they don't have to work again. Okay, and then finally, I will definitely not have time to talk about this, but we can look at both. Previously, if I've looked at the scores, I can also do some language processing on the comments and look at these, and I find that actually comments have very little effect. Once we condition on the scores, the comments are actually pretty much just noise. Okay. All right, so what is an online labor market? So the one I'm looking at is Upwork, or well, when I looked at it, it was Odesk. Now it's Upwork. So this is kind of the profile of a worker. So as a worker, you can create kind of a profile. It's kind of like your resume. So you can create put whatever information you want on there. But the key features of your profile are going to be kind of your work history, right? On this platform, right? And so the idea here is you've worked some jobs on this. It shows how long you worked at what wage, and then this review. Okay, and the idea on these platforms and this kind of reputation system is that these reviews are providing a lot of information about how good this worker is. Without those reviews, we wouldn't know very much about this worker. Okay, this is a website. It's the internet. You don't know that that person's not actually a dog, right? So there's some, we were hoping that the reviews are actually providing information. Okay, there's also, that you can take exams, so you can take kind of standardized tests on this platform, and provide self-reported employment history and education. Okay, so that's the worker side. On the job side, this is a sample job listing that a firm will post, kind of providing a little information about what they want you to do, and then the worker can apply to these jobs. One thing I want you to notice is this is the number of applications to this job, which is more than 50. And that's actually consistent across a lot of the data. So the average, I think the average number of applications to a single job is something like 42 or something in my data. Okay, so there's lots of applications. We would think that, in this case, firms have a lot of market power, right? Because they're able to pick from a lot of people. And so, workers, when we get to the results about workers, being able to force firms to leave good reviews, that might be a little surprising given this setting, right? Because they don't actually have much power in this case. Okay. Yeah, and you can also see the client's work history, to see kind of what they've done. Okay, so the data is the universe of Odesk workers who are active in the administrative job category. So this is primarily kind of data entry and like administrative assistant jobs. So they're relatively low wage. I'll show that in a second. In this little window, I kind of scrape the data at the end of in April, and then I'm going to kind of back out the panel of these workers. Okay, so I see that their whole profile at that point in time, including their entire work history, and then I'm going to say, okay, when you got your first job, this is what your profile looked like. When you got your second job, your profile had your first job on it, and so forth. And so my data is just going to be a panel of about a little over 15,000 workers. Okay. All right. So here's the summary stats of workers, primarily from lower middle income countries. So this is India and the Philippines mostly. Average wage is a little $5.50 an hour. So that's low by US standards, but it's not actually low by Indian or Philippine standards. And the average job is about a month long at 40 hours a week. Okay, so this is long enough that employers are able to learn something, presumably are able to learn about how good that worker is. But it's short enough that I see at least seven, on average 7 jobs for each worker. Okay. And then this last one is just one thing we might be worried about is, a single worker has a bunch of different jobs at the same time, and then trying to disentangle which reviews are, what someone's looking at is difficult. But this is saying that conditional on having a job, you only have 1.2 jobs. So it's mostly sequential work. So you're looking at the previous reviews when you get hired again. Okay, so here's the density of reviews. This shouldn't be all that surprising to people who know these platforms. We have lots and lots of mass at a perfect review. So these are, you can get between a 1 and a 5. So right away, this is a little weird, like, everyone's just getting perfect reviews. To deal with this, rather than just trying to look at a linear effect, I'm going to recategorize this as a good review if it's perfect, a bad review if it's between a 4 and a 5, and a really bad review if it's less than a 4. Okay? And you might say, well, a bad review at a 4.99 seems a little weird, but it's the 29th percentile. Okay? So at some level, it is kind of a bad review. And then I also, you don't have to leave a review. And you might think back to the original example, of hiring an RA, you just don't say anything, right? Just don't provide any information. Don't leave a review, right? That would be my kind of logical thing, rational thing to do. But it turns out that in this case, about 75% of jobs have reviews in this case. Okay, so people are providing reviews, so there's got to be some incentive for them to do that. Okay, so that's the review data. So let's get into the results. So what I'm going to do is look at wages, right? So we think that wages are going to be some function of worker productivity, and the idea is that these reviews are providing information about this worker productivity. Okay, and if we see there being an effect of reviews on wages, that's kind of evidence that there's something about there's some information about their worker productivity being captured in that review. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the early careers of workers. I'm not really, because the average was 7, so I'm just limiting some of the really long careers. And I'm going to limit my sample to only jobs in which you're not being rehired, right? Because what I want is the effect of public information, these public reviews, right? I don't want to be capturing the private information of a rehire. They already know something about you. Okay, so I'm only going to look at times when you're being hired by a new firm that you haven't worked for before. And I'm just going to run a simple regression of the change in your log wage, okay, as a function of your most recent review of those 4 different review types. I'm going to interact that with a dummy for time, because I want to look at kind of a time path of learning, right? Look at comparing kind of early career to later career and see if we see kind of in a Bayesian updating world, right? Your early reviews would matter a lot, and then that would taper off, right? Like a batting average. And then I have a bunch of controls, basically the profile from workers. I have job characteristics, so that's just using the titles in the jobs, and then worker and firm fixed effects, right? So my identification is just coming from kind of comparing identical workers working identical jobs for identical firms, right? And we're just going to vary kind of the type of their previous review. Okay. So here's the results. First, I want you to focus on column 2, right? Column 2 is with both worker and firm fixed effects. And so this says relative to a bad review, which is the omitted type, receiving a really bad review decreases your next period wage by about 11% in the first 5 jobs, right? But then that drops to about 3% and insignificant after 5 jobs. Okay, so this says these reviews are really important at the beginning of your career, and then aren't that important later on, which is pretty intuitive. Same thing, good review relative to bad review is marginally significant, and then drops to basically a 0. Okay, so this is comparing identical workers going to identical firms. If we get rid of the firm fixed effects, this is allowing you can think of it as sorting by workers, right? So here, if we control it, we're saying everyone's going to work for the same firm. Now we're saying you can sort into different firms, and we conditional on observing that these being the true effects, right? The fact that we get a smaller effect there, right, says that there is some sorting going on. And in fact, we're seeing sorting in kind of the reasonable direction. Okay, so if you could go work for this kind of firm and receive a wage bump of 4%, or you could potentially go work for a better firm but only receive a wage bump of 2%. Okay, same thing on the negative direction. Or at least that's one way to interpret those results. There's others too. So this is, certainly column 2 is providing some evidence that there is information in these reviews. We are seeing wages being affected by them. Okay, we can do this parametrically too if we wanted to. Okay. All right. So let's look at attrition. So if a worker has a reservation wage, right, then you receive a bad review that drops your future potential wage below that reservation wage. You're going to leave the market, potentially leave the market. Okay, we can test this. Discrete time proportional hazard model. Just throw in where the outcome of interest is whether you're hired again. Throw in everything, all of the controls that we want, and we can look at the hazard rates. Okay, so ignore the no review top line for a second. We see relative, this is relative to bad review again, right? This is really bad review. This is good review. And again, so really bad review, higher hazard rate, more likely to leave. In the early going, tapers to 0. Good review, less likely, tapers to 0. Okay, so this is, again, kind of suggestive of these things working, providing some information about how long. Then we have this no review, which I'm still looking for a good explanation of why we see this. Okay, so my current hypothesis is workers have kind of this implicit, they believe they should be getting a review in this market. They think they're important. They are important. and when they don't, they get mad and leave. But I'm open to suggestions on what else this could explain, because it's pretty stark that receiving no review is way worse than receiving a 1-star review, which seems surprising. But and we also, so this is for actual attrition of actually leaving the market. We also see it for time to your next job. So in the same way, we see it takes longer to get your next job if you get a really bad review relative to a bad review, relative to a good review. Okay, so we see it. So this is kind of further evidence of information in this market, and it also means that our wage results are attenuated, right? So this attrition is working in the same way, so the wage results are actually going to be stronger because we're basically just truncating the tail of that distribution. Okay, so I've hoped that I've kind of convinced you that there is information in these reviews, and then the question is why? Why are firms providing this private information when they kind of potentially are hurting their own interests? Okay. And so I have 2 quotes from the kind of forum for this online labor market. The first is from a worker that basically says, look, if they're trying to give me 4 stars and then trying to rehire me, that's not going to happen because you gave me 4 stars, right? If you want to rehire me, you're going to have to give me 5 stars. And then the second one is from a firm that's basically like, we don't want to like rock this boat. We don't want to cause problems in this relationship. That's why we're just going to give everybody a good review. Okay, so this could be, the story here is that, if you want to rehire a worker, you kind of need to reward them so that they're going to stay with you, despite the fact that there's, lots and lots of other workers that you could replace this other worker. Okay, so I'm going to try and test this using application data. Okay, so I'm going to look at the effect of the review you got from a firm, right, on your subsequent decision about whether to match with that firm again. Okay, so I have 11,000 completed jobs, and then I look for subsequent job postings by the firm, and then applications by the worker to those jobs. Okay, I can observe who initiated who initiated the application, whether it was the worker or the firm. So most applications are just initiated by the worker. They send out their application, but the firm can also reach out to a worker and say, you should apply to this job. Okay, and then I see the outcome. So I see whether or not they were hired or not. Okay, I'm going to model this just as a bivariate probit. So each worker and firm is going to get, the worker and firm are going to get an individual shock, potentially correlated, and then they're going to make their kind of individual decision about whether to match. So here's the simple decision tree, right? So if a worker and a firm both want to match, we're going to see a hire. If we see one wants but the other doesn't, we're going to see that type of initiation, but no hire. And then if neither of them, we're going to see no application. Right? Here's just the bivariate probit and the full likelihood. Right? We're just going to do the standard normal. And then we're just going to include, so the variables we include are just going to be everything from the other specifications. Okay. So here is the firm's kind of results. Okay, so what this says is this is the probability of wanting to match, and it says that the firm wants to hire a worker again if they gave them a good review, right? So this is again kind of, I think this is less strong than the previous evidence, but this is, that firms are being honest, right? If you leave someone a good review, that means you're, like them and you would potentially want to hire them, okay? What we're really interested in is what does the workers' picture look like, right? Because that's like, are the workers responding in a similar or a different way? And it turns out the workers are responding very similarly, okay? So that workers, likewise, if they get a good review, want to work again. If they don't, they basically don't want anything to do with that firm. Okay, so workers are kind of exerting the same kind of sway where they're just going to walk away if they don't get a good review. Okay. Yeah, I burned through that. So I'm not going to go through it, but basically, I also look at interactions of the review comments. So I classify the review comments with some very not as advanced natural language processing. Oh, I didn't burn through that. OK, cool. And kind of interact them and find that the comments actually don't they don't actually seem to matter. Okay, so they don't affect wages. So comments are basically not being priced into the wage, so you would think that a firm actually has this incentive to kind of leave a really good comment. So what I'm thinking is, say I'm a firm, I know that if I leave a slightly bad review, that's going to bias down the wage. But then I know that the worker's going to leave. But if I can convince the worker to stay by leaving them this glowing review, then maybe I'm golden, right? But it turns out that neither other firms nor workers pay any attention to the comments, or at least doesn't seem like they do. So it's mostly just the stars which matter in this case. Okay, so I'm hoping that I have provided at least some evidence that there is information in these reviews in this online labor market, despite kind of this incentive to be uninformative if you're interested in rehiring someone. I tried to provide some evidence of a mechanism why we might expect this, and I think this actually does have kind of some important implications for the gig economy, for these platforms as they continue to grow. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Our discussion. John Horton from the Stern School of Business.
So I'd like to start by just kind of getting into what I think is at stake with this paper, sort of why the question matters. If you think about conventional labor markets, one thing that characterizes them is a lot of time is spent acquiring information about both workers and firms, and a lot of that information it dies with the relationship, right? A lot of what the firm and the worker learned, it never really spills out of that relationship, and that's kind of wasteful. But I think that characterization is changing as more and more of the labor market is becoming computer mediated. So Odesk, Upwork, it's sizable, but I think it's sort of maybe a canary in the coal mine, or I don't know what exactly the right metaphor is, but sort of the labor market generally is moving to this place where aspects of the employment relationship are now throwing off data that could potentially be used. So I'd say LinkedIn is probably the sort of most consequential example of this, but we also have Glassdoor and other sites that are doing something similar. So I think the big question is, can we harvest that information and then use it? Either give it to other firms, give it to other workers. Part of Alex's question is, in this particular context, are employers actually going to use this information, right? And does it get reflected in wages? And then I think what I'll talk a bit about is what are the sort of secondary consequences of doing this. So it creates some interesting other questions. Once what happens in a relationship spill over, how does that affect other things? So, Alex did a nice job presenting what the paper does. It uses within worker variation in past feedback scores to estimate the effect on future wages. So with good feedback, future wages go up. Bad feedback causes workers to exit the market. So, my main kind of thing that this paper stimulated my thinking about is, what do we think of as the economic content of that feedback score, and what margins do workers adjust on following feedback? So, we see this wage effect, but there's a lot of other things that workers could do in response, and that's something I want to think more about. So, what do we think is in the feedback? I think it's important to think of feedback as being at least partially mediated by the price that was paid for whatever was delivered. I might say McDonald's is a 5-star restaurant when I only had to pay $2, but if I had to pay a lot of money, my star rating might go down. So should we think of honest feedback as basically the surplus that's generated maybe mapped to stars? But then this raises the question, do workers lower their proposed prices in response to getting bad feedback? That would kind of be a parsimonious explanation for what Alex sees, right? They kind of incorporate it. And so do employers looking at what happened, do they say, oh, well, look, a person got 4 stars at $12 an hour, but then they got 5 stars would get 5 stars if they were paid $10 an hour. And then this might make the sequence of feedbacks that are generated kind of quickly get to some sort of market feedback where all the variance gets pushed into the wage. And Alex actually kind of has some evidence that this is the case, right? The variance in the wage grows over time. And the fact that the feedback distribution gets degenerate, where it's sort of just all at 5, is perhaps also evidence that this is what's happening. You could think of this as if you're getting exceptionally good feedback, maybe you just didn't charge enough, right? You're leaving money on the table in this context. So the other thing I was thinking a bit about is other margins of adjustment that are available to workers. So in the paper, Alex, he treats the jobs that people get as essentially exogenous. But I think if we think about what's going on, it's at least partly the result of some decision making that are made by workers and firms after they see what the feedback was. So when a worker gets the feedback, do they change their intensity with which they apply to jobs, right? More or less often? Do they seek out harder or easier jobs? If I got bad feedback, do I try to repair it? By going and, I'll go find that cream puff employer that I know is going to hook me up with a great rating. Like, how do I think about this? And you keep pushing on this. You think, do workers kind of have this dynamic programming problem to solve of like, well, if I could get a better feedback now, sort of what's my payoff to doing this in the future? And maybe this sounds too complicated, but I think my experience with Upwork or Odesk is that workers are very savvy and they learn very quickly and they kind of pick up the right strategy pretty quickly. So it'd be interesting to see if there's some evidence for this kind of behavior. And maybe one idea to get at this, the precise time when the feedback is released, it might be possible to do some event studies, the behavior right before it hits the market and right after. And you can see, does it change their application intensity? Do you sort of see wage bids all of a sudden start changing right when the employer leaves the feedback and it becomes public? I think this plot was actually very troubling within the company. And the view was that the informational content of the feedback system was basically gone. And so even if employers were learning from it, we weren't really getting what we wanted out of it. And so they actually moved to a new system where they collect private feedback from the employer, batch it up, and then release aggregates of that, right? And the thinking in the company was at least that the main reason feedback was so shifted to the right was that it was more that employers didn't want the hassle of giving bad feedback. It was sort of, there was no upside in giving bad feedback. You would just sort of get punished for it. And so, I think the idea is very similar to kind of the grade inflation dynamic that we're all familiar with, which is, no one in the history of higher ed has ever come to complain about an A, right? So I think, just to wrap up, I think it's a great paper. I think the questions are important, and I'm sort of looking forward to seeing what happens next.
Thank you.
I don't have much of a response to that, except that sounded a lot like my future research statement that I wrote for, I'm on the job market, and like 2 or 3 of those things ended up in there. So, I mean, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because he's going to beat me to it, but whatever, it's all good. So, questions?
Wondering, when you mentioned the idea of like good reviews and retention or re-attracting a worker and everything, so and the cost of that as well. Like if a worker leaves, they go to a new place, it will probably cost you nothing, so to say, or then in the new place he'll earn less, right? So it costs them less. But then if they do have a good review and somehow you convince them to stay because you're gold, won't that cost you a lot more in the end? I don't know how much of that is taken into account.
Yeah, no, I mean, so,
Bigger picture.
yeah. I mean, and I don't know for sure. I mean, I think in my mind what I'm thinking about is, you're drawing from this pool of workers that you know nothing about, taking you know something about this one, taking another draw from that pool might be very costly. So you're willing to kind of pay a little bit more of a premium for the one that you already knew something about. And then that cost, like the cost of drawing again, is higher than the cost of leaving a good review. Is why we see that behavior. But again, I don't know for sure. Yeah.
How sensitive your results are based on the definition of bad or good?
So I mean, good is hard to change because it's. It would be it would be great to be able to break up that 5, but the one caveat I think is that I'm seeing that there's information relative to the other things, but that's only 30% of the distribution, right? Because there's 70% of the mass is in this perfect score. So it's not very sensitive to changing the definition of like really bad and bad, like moving that around a lot. And I've tried it with a bunch of different cuts, and it doesn't seem to change.
How much percentage was this 5? So is it like 70%?
It's like 70%, yeah. So yeah, so I mean, it would be great to be able to break that up, and I think that's what Odusk was trying to do, is because you're leaving a ton of information there.
Yeah. The second question is, can you give us some intuition about why workers with really low reviews stay in the market? I mean, why they find it out, for example? Can you give us an intuition?
I mean, I think maybe just they learn from it, right? I mean, so if you're, I think that's one thing that John was pointing out, right? Is workers are potentially learning, as well, right? And so you get a bad review, you're like, oh, like I'm not very good at this, but let me try something else, right? Or I'm gonna, work much harder the next time, or something like that. So maybe they are just kind of learning about, that. But I mean, I don't really know.
And the third and last question: do you think that workers here do not review firms?
They do. They do. So I wasn't dealing with that. Okay. But it's simultaneous and blind. So there's not like a retaliation factor. So you wouldn't be worried about leaving a bad review because in that sense.
What is the distribution there in the reviews? Is it the same?
It's similar. I don't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean it looks pretty similar.